Hi, my name is Clint Goodman, and I believe in making strong APIs with good documentation. So I made this tutorial which will introduce you to a set of tools that I've been using for a while to create APIs, all using node.js and several other npm packages. And I'm excited to show you what I had today. I gave this presentation this past week to Utah.js, and I unfortunately forgot to push the record button at the time that I needed to, and so I'm trying to repeat that presentation here and get it recorded. So let's begin. The way this presentation is going to follow is that I have created this GitHub repo, and I'll include the link in the description below. And what happens is I want to start us off by creating a Hapi server, and then in 10 short steps create a very powerful API that will demonstrate some of the cool technologies here. And so to give you an example of what we're going to be building, by the end of tonight we'll be building this API and this UI for the API, which will give us several different endpoints, and ultimately I also have a sample client for this API. Nothing fancy, but as you can see I could log in and get all this information. This particular client, all it is doing is getting a list of Star Wars characters, and then we can upvote or downvote Star Wars characters, and we'll see here by the end of this presentation that these are live statistics using web sockets, and the documentation is pretty sweet on this type of stuff, and also basic authentication. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's first off reset this repository to the bare bones, so we have a little to work off of. So I'm going to show you here. I believe that you can create really good APIs, production-ready APIs, using just Node.js and writing all JavaScript. And so let's introduce Hapi. What is Hapi? Well, as the story goes, Walmart a few years ago was trying to build a service. They were using Express.js for their service, and I've used Express.js before. It's a good option. It definitely has some things that I even like better than Hapi, and some things I don't like as much. But anyway, Walmart got really frustrated, and so they built their own version, their own competition to Express, which was called Hapi, H-A-P-I. And so I think since then it's been broken off into its own project, and I think it's its own company. Don't quote me on that. But a lot of people have been working on Hapi. It has a very strong ecosystem with lots of plugins, and is very, very easy to use, and I really enjoy it. So let's dig in. Hapi, to be able to start Hapi is pretty easy here. We just create a new Hapi server. We ask it to listen on a specific host and port. And then really there's just 3 different steps here. So the first is to register all of our plugins. What I'm doing is I'm declaring plugins up here, which is nothing more than this file. Right now, it's an empty array. We have no plugins that we are registering right now, but we'll be changing that pretty quick. Second thing we do is we initialize a bunch of routes, and routes is being imported from this file, and I'm actually going to delete this and build it with you guys. So right now, let's just assume that routes is also an empty array, and there is nothing there for us. And then the third thing that we do is we just start listening for requests. And so what will happen is Hapi, whenever a request comes in to the Hapi server, then it'll send it to the appropriate route and then respond back with what the route tells it to do. So we'll go over all that in just a second. So that's Hapi, and let's build our very first endpoint. So let's go here back to routes, and routes is just an array of objects where each object is an endpoint. So here's how you start setting up this particular route. First, you have to say what method this route is going to use. So these are HTTP methods. So for this, we're just going to use a get method. Typically, we use get and post a lot in the HTML world, but you can also put in there delete, put, options, all of those other HTTP methods. So method is the first thing. The second thing is we're going to tell it the path to match to. So I'm choosing to go by this convention of /API/v1, and then our first path is going to be characters. This is going to get all the characters for all the Star Wars characters that we want to work with. Okay. So then what we need to do is we need to configure this route, and the first thing we're going to do is pass it a handler, meaning that whenever a request comes in to this particular route on this path, then we want to forward that request to be handled by a handler. Now, I've set up handlers here using require directory. Basically, all it's doing is creating an index for all the files inside of handlers. So characters is one of those files, so I'm going to use handlers.characters, and then I'm going to use this method, which I have in handlers characters, and we'll go over the, well, let's do it now actually. Before we do, let's add a description here. So this endpoint will get all these Star Wars characters. Cool. I'll show you why we have this description here on step 3. But first, let's go to the handlers, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this and we'll write that together. But right now we're using get all characters, and it's already up and running, and so we're not going to delete that. And so let me explain to you how this works. Each handler is a function that accepts 2 parameters, a request object and a reply method. So the request object will contain all the information about the request that came into the API. It'll tell about the client, it'll tell about the IP address, it'll tell it'll have the payload on there, the query strings, the parameters that we use, and all sorts of information. So the request is going to be very useful. It's basically all of our input, and reply is what we're going to send back, so it's our output. So it's just the easiest way to use reply is to use it as a function, and we reply back with data. So in this case, every time we're receiving stuff, we're going to be sending back JSON because this is an API. So that's going to be our output for everything today. So as we see here in just a few lines, what we're going to do is not going to bother us too much about the details here, but for this particular endpoint, we're expecting 3 different query strings to be passed. And so the 3 different query strings are page, limit, and sort. And what I'm going to do is I'm using Swappy. Swappy is just an online API that's free, and it has a bunch of Star Wars data. It stands for Star Wars API. So swappy.co. So I've built this whole data handler service for a code challenge that I had a long time ago. So I just pasted that here. I'm not going to go into how to use this because that's not the purpose of this presentation. But needless to say, we get characters from Swappy, and then we transform the character data that we got from Swappy, and then right here we reply back with the transformed data. If there are any errors, then I'm going to reply with just a server status code of 500, which is internal error. So pretty simple handler, right? Of course, to make everything work, I have this little Swappy thing, but again, that's not really the purpose of this presentation. This purpose is to learn about Hapi and how to build APIs. So let's go ahead and let's go ahead and see if that works. So I'm going to come back here, and while live demoing, I just hope that everything works. So API/v1/characters. Let's wait for a second. Boom! It worked. It responded back with JSON. So it's an array full of objects, and each of these objects is a person. So that's kind of cool. Glad that worked. Let's go back and add a second route just to learn a little bit more and have more stuff to play with. So this is also going to be using get. The path on this is going to be /AP1 API-v1 character, and then here we're going to make this a dynamic parameter. So I'll show you how that works in a second. And then the config for this is going to be the handler. It's going to be handlers.character.getCharacter by name. Perfect. So, and then the description. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Get a specific character from Star Wars API. Cool. So, let's learn about this name parameter. This is very similar to Express.js syntax. What it basically does is this allows the person who's using our API to put whatever they want has this part of the path. So if they would put /Luke or /Leia or /R2D2, then that makes this part of the path or the route flexible or dynamic, and it'll put whatever text that they put there inside of the request underneath the request.params object, and then it'll be named whatever we put here, in this case name. So let's go ahead and build a handler for this so we can see how that works. It's actually going to look quite a bit like this handler, so we're going to paste a lot of it, except for instead of getting things off of the query strings, we're going to get things off of the parameter object. And what we're going to grab is the name of our dynamic parameter, which is name. And then here we're going to do swappy character, transform character. Instead of passing in these things, we're passing in name. Again, not worried about how the swappy thing works, just more about how Hapi works in general. So if I save this, I'll show you how this works, and again, we hope that this does work. So if I do character/Luke, it did not work. Let's see what our problem is. I made a mistake here. I'm going to say characters. Okay, let's see. Beautiful. Okay, sweet. Do you see what happened? This can be whatever we want it to be, and whatever we want it to be will get thrown into this request.params.name, and we're deconstructing it here. So if I were to put Leia, which I'm not sure if I know how to spell, yep, perfect. See, we got Leia back. So that's cool. So these are two basic routes that we can use, and this just describes kind of how Hapi works. Again, it's a lot like Express, except for instead of middleware, well, we don't have middleware. We have plugins instead of Hapi, but we haven't gone over that yet. So give that just a second to marinate, and we will proceed on. So the second thing that I want to explain is this npm package called Joy. Joy is part of the Hapi ecosystem, and it works really awesome. What it is it's used to validate input coming in, as well as used to validate output going out. Now, when we talk about output going out from an API, we can create a schema of acceptable outputs that come from our API. And so Hapi also refers to those as schemas. So validation going out, we can validate it against the schema, and if they don't match, then it'll show an error instead of actually giving that data. As well as input coming in, we can validate against some rules that we set up. And if what comes in doesn't match those rules, then it will send back an intuitive message to the user saying, we can't process that request because the input that you gave us is wrong, and here's exactly what is wrong, and here's how to fix it. So that's really cool. So let's go ahead and go over that right now. So let's start with name, because this is going to be easy. So what you do is you add this validate object right here, and of course we can validate query strings, we can validate path parameters, which are these, and we can validate payload, so like the JSON payload that you might be giving us. So I'm going to go ahead and just, we only are using parameters on this particular path, on this endpoint. So I'm going to put params here, and the parameter that we want to validate is called name. I got that from right here. So here's the way Joy works. I guess we better import it first of all. Require Joy. So here's their syntax. Is this an object? I'm going to pass here an object, and I'm going to put the object on multiple lines, and you'll see why, just for organization purposes. So it's a Joy object, and what it's going to be is we want to make sure that name is a string. Okay, we always need the name, so I'm going to say that it's required. Here I'm going to give a description. I'm going to say name of Star Wars character. Sweet, and I'm going to give an example here. That's going to be Luke. Okay. So, and I'll explain to you later why I do the description and .examples here. It's not just for programmers, but you'll see why when we get to Swagger. So what this will do is, if what comes in is not a string, which an HTTP request is kind of funny because everything is a string. So, but ignoring that, if it doesn't have it, because it's required, it'll throw back an error and different things like that. Maybe it will make more sense. Let's validate some of the things here, and it'll be even more clear. So the things that we have here are query strings, which if you look, we're expecting page and limit to be integers and sorts to be a string. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get all those. So page is going to be a Joy, and it's going to be a number, not just any type of number. It's going to be an integer. So this gets rid of decimal values. We're going to add an actual default here. So if they don't put a page number, if they don't provide it, then the handler is actually going to go ahead and use the value of 1, which is pretty cool. Description, page number, that was very descriptive. An example would be 1. Cool. Let's go ahead and validate I already forgot, limit. So limit is also going to be a joy number, integer. I'm going to also put a default of 20 here. A description, limit of results, and an example would be 20. What do you know? Oops. So then the last thing was the sort, and it's going to be joy, but this one's going to be a string. We're going to have the default to be name. We're going to say that the possible values, which I think in joy is valid, are going to be, you can either sort by name. I happen to know you can sort by age, or you can sort by planet. There's a few other options, but it's just all a sample. And a description, so sort by key, and an example is going to be name. Cool. So let's hope that we did this right, and let's go ahead and try to go to characters, and let's go ahead and use limit equals. So we said that it had to be an integer. What if I were to put not an integer? So we're getting there here. Routes 54. Let me go back and clean this up real quick before we go back. Oh, that was silly. Okay, sweet. So here we did not put an integer, and so when we try to request that from the API, we get back this very intuitive message. It says bad request. So the child limit fails because limit must be a number. It didn't pass the validation. And it tells us, where did this limit come from, because it says child limit. Well, what it is a query string. And so if I were to put here the limit to be a 3, should work here. And again, it's going to use the default of page 1 and then sort by name. And is it sorting by name? Yes, CLR. So that's kind of cool. So if I were to try to say page equals also something that's not an integer, it's going to give us a problem. It's not a number, right? A few other cool things with joy. I could say that the minimum has to be 0. So if on our limit we say -3, we can't do that because it fails, because the limit must be larger than or equal to 0. So it's a way to validate things coming in. Very, very awesome. Very cool. But like I explained before, we can actually validate things going out, so against a schema. So what you do here is you say the response, and you say here's the schema that we want to validate it against. And what does it expect here? Another joy object. So my kind of convention, and I'm not sure if this is a good idea or not, but my particular convention would be to put the schema here inside of the handler, because this handler is going to return a response. And so if I want to see what kind of response it should be, I should put the schema here. And so that I can look at this and this at the same time and make sure that this schema, which is going to be using characters, so I'm going to put characters here. And I'll put the, actually not characters like that, it's going to be a joy object. And then what I'll do is I will import that schema object here. Now I'm going to cheat a little bit because I can, and I'm going to skip ahead and just show you what that would look like. Getting used to Atom, and I'm not sure why it doesn't just go ahead and open up. So schema is going to import in this .schema.character. We'll go to the handler here, and we'll see that I have this schema, and what it is joy again, but a little bit different syntax because what we're returning back is a JSON object. So I'm saying here a single character represents a joy object which has these keys. A key of ID, which must be a number, is required as an integer, the minimum is 0, all this different stuff. A name is a string. birth, gender, home, films is an array of items which are strings. Cool. It's kind of like strong typing, huh? And then here's what I'm going to say, and I'm using a getter here. It's a lazy way to be able to say this dot character. But really, characters is going to be nothing more than a joy array with the items that are character objects, which is this puppy right there. So I export all of that, and what will happen is, let me see, when I say characters, gotta do something good. So if what I returned here did not match this schema, where the ID, if the ID wasn't a integer, if it was a string, for instance, let's go ahead and make that possible. Let's see, so transform here, I'm putting a transform and I'm making this into an int. I'm actually going to typecast it into a string, and then push refresh, and we'll see here what happens. That was unexpected. Maybe did not understand the JavaScript correctly. I'm embarrassed right now, but let's try this. Let's take out ID, which we said was required. Okay, I obviously don't know my JavaScript well enough because it was validating a string being the same thing as an integer, and so I'll have to go back and see what I did wrong. But what the response will be is just a generic 500 error. They won't know what went wrong because this really is your fault. It's on the server, so we don't want to expose that to the user. But here we will get a error message in our logs, which is a list of characters of position 0 failed because ID failed because ID is required. So we can kind of find out some information there. Again, I'm a little embarrassed. I'm not sure why both integers and strings were acceptable there, but whatever. Let's move on. So that's joy, J-O-I. So joy and happy brings a lot of joy and happiness. So the next technology is pretty simple. It's called Boom. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and show you all that I'm doing here. I'm going to skip ahead in this repository to Boom. Now, Boom is also part of the Hapi ecosystem. It's what allows error handling to occur. And basically, I'm not going to dig too much into it, this particular tutorial, but I'm importing it here. And then all I'm using it here is to wrap the generic errors that we're getting here. And what will happen is this. If in one of these then statements, what gets returned is a boom error, and you can see the syntax online, the boom API is pretty sweet. If error happens to be a boom error, then this default parameter is not going to apply, right? This ES6 default parameter, it'll just be the boom error. And when it wraps it, it'll use that boom error. And so if I pass it a boom error of 404 for not found, then it'll go ahead and use that here. If it's just a generic JavaScript error, then this wrap function will just return a 500. But I'll show you here in Swappy what I'm doing is if I'm looking for a character and it's not found in the particular API that I'm searching, then I use this boom create this error 404. And there's a lot of different ways to use boom. I'm not actually sure why I say create error there. But anyway, so this handler will return 404. But if what gets returned is just a regular JavaScript error, then I'll use 500 instead. Basically, if I'll show you here, character slash, let's go to Luke, some crazy thing. Look at that. It says 404 not found. That's the short and simple of why I was using boom there, is so that I can respond back with different error statuses. So I don't think that was a very good explanation, but it's not all that exciting, so I'm going to move on. So to the really exciting part and the real purpose of this entire presentation, which is Swagger. So what is Swagger? Well, let's talk about it. Swagger is awesome, first of all, and it is a specification about APIs. So if I go here, we'll find out that it's part of the Open API initiative. And what it is people like Google and everyone else, they create these APIs and they want people to use them. And so this is a way of standardizing how to make your APIs, first of all. But second of all, the end endpoint, the whole purpose of Swagger is to produce a JSON object that describes your API and everything about your API and how to use it. So that's really all that Swagger is trying to do, is it's trying to create a swagger.json object which people can see, so that way they can go to your API and understand it describes your API. Here's the different paths. Here's what the paths are expecting. Here's what the paths would be returning. And so if I was dumb and I didn't know how to use the YouTube API and there was no documentation on it, I could go to their swagger.json file and find out a lot of information about their API. Now the reason why this is important to you is because you make great APIs and it's important to make strong APIs, but it does you no good to make APIs if people can't use them because they don't know how to. Why did you make the API in the first place if it's not usable? So this helps document your API, and as you'll see here in a second, Hapi has a plugin called Hapi Swagger, which gives you all this for free with no additional programming that you need to do. You don't need to do anything to your endpoints than what we've already done. It'll use all of that information and build the swagger.json file for you. So that's what Swagger is, and let me explain the second benefit, which is actually probably the real big benefit, is that because Swagger produces this swagger.json file that describes your API really, really well, then Swagger says, we have all this information. We can build a tool called Swagger UI, which digests this swagger.json information, and it can build a user interface for you to be able to play around with this API, to be able to see a lot of information about this API, and it's called Swagger UI, and it's really cool. And the Hapi-Swagger npm module is awesome. So let's go over that and see how that works. First off, let me show you how to install it. I said that it comes for free. That is more or less true. What I meant by that is that we don't have to add anything additional to the routes to get it to work, except for this. We need to, tags are actually part of Hapi, and they're optional. They're an optional configuration thing. I accidentally put it in the wrong space in the source code, and that's my bad. And all you need to do is you need to make sure that there is an API in the array of tags. And everything that is tagged with API will show up in the Swagger JSON document. The purpose of that is so that if you didn't want a route to show up in the JSON, the Swagger JSON, then you could hide it by just not putting the tag API in it. So if I save those two things, this enables our routes to be shown in the Swagger. Let's go to our plugins here. So Swagger, I'm importing this configuration object, and I'll show you that in a second. In order to get Swagger to work, Swagger has two dependencies that it relies on, inert and vision. Pretty easy. Those are both npm packages. I just install them that easy. So far Swagger's been a pretty easy install. The only thing that was a bit of a trick is making the Swagger configuration. It's really not tricky, and in fact most of this isn't necessary, but I was playing around with it and found some uses to it, and you can use my example if you want, or your own, however it works. But basically what I'm doing here is I'm creating a plugin where I'm using the Hapi Swagger npm module, okay, and I provide it with some metadata. Here's the title of our API, here's the description of our API, here's the version of our API, here's who's maintaining it, me. Here's our license, and this documentation path is telling Hapi which route to use to show the UI. So I'm just using the base. So if you go to localhost 7777, then show the UI or the documentation. The rest of this is kind of fluff, and I won't go into it, but it's to organize the different tags, and I'm not even sure if I'm crazy about how I did this, but I was playing around with it and it worked out okay. So this is all the effort. Really, this file is your biggest effort in installing Hapi Swagger. And I keep emphasizing that because it's really easy to document now our Hapi server with very, very little cost associated. So if I go to what we said was our documentation path, here's what we get. Here's the Swagger UI. I skipped ahead a step. I should have showed you first the swagger.json file. So let's go see that first. So here's the .json file. What it is it describes our API. Here is the version of our API. Here's the description of it. Some of those things that we were looking at before. Here are the different paths that you can use in our API. So /v1/characters. What it accepts is it accepts get requests, and it accepts these parameters: an integer with a default. Here's our joy object, really, right here. And it also accepts a number of results per page. So it is our limit, and it's a query string. Here's another query string called sort, and it's the key on which to sort results. And here's the tags associated with this endpoint. So it also describes here the response that this API endpoint gives. If it's a 200 response, meaning everything was okay, then it's going to use this schema. And for some reason, it's just a Swagger thing to throw the schema at the bottom. So in this definitions, so here's a character, and here is basically our joy object. So this is the .json file. Now, because we have this file, if we send this file to anyone else, or if we make this file public, then people can consume it in the UI, and the Hapi-Swagger npm module just does that for us automatically in the background. And we can see here several things. So here's our description, which I just have a bunch of links. Here's the created by stuff. And then here's our first tag of Star Wars. And we have two endpoints here. They're both gets. Here's one endpoint. And if I click on it, I can find out a lot of cool things about it. So this is what is just so exciting about Swagger. Without even ever having to run this endpoint, I already know what it's going to return. Here's an example response. And this was just built off of our joy objects that we created earlier. So here's an example response. It could have an ID of 1, a name that kind of looks like Luke, or something like that. And this is a sample response. If we wanted just to find out like the types that are going to return, we can just go here to the model, and it's going to say that it is returning an object where the ID is an integer, and here's what the ID means. Here's the name, here's the birth, gender. Look, it'll even tell us it's going to be male, female, or not applicable. So we can find out, as we're consuming this API, we already get a lot of information about it, right? So this portion here of the Swagger UI is just telling us what a response is going to look like. If we want to try it out, then Swagger also builds for us a place to put all the available inputs for this endpoint, and then a try it out button. So I'm going to click try it out, and check this out. First off, it'll tell us what command it ran. So if I wanted to do this myself in a browser, I can copy and paste this URL, and it's going to do the same thing as returning this response body. So all this part is just the response of that URL. So here's the response. You'll see it's not exactly like the example because, well, the example was just an example, right? It only had one film. This shows actually all the films that Luke Skywalker was in, and also some information about the request headers and stuff. So this is pretty sweet, well worth the time implementing, and well worth using Hapi-Swagger for very little cost. Now we have a way to be able to view and explore our API in a very easy way. Look here, it already recognized that our default values were 1, 10, and name for these different inputs. And if I were to put something different, like if I just wanted 1, page 1 with just 1 limit, look, there's just 1. If I wanted 2, bada bing, bada bang. So we get 2. Very cool. Look at that, it's sorted by name. So this is pretty exciting stuff. I hope you're seeing the value here of being able to see our API, and as we get more and more routes, like by the end of this, we're going to have over a dozen routes, and we can see all of them. We can play around with all of them, and then again, APIs are so important to build because it's just the day and age that we live in. But if people don't know how to use your API, it was pointless to build one. You shouldn't have built it. And so this provides easy documentation on your API at very little cost to you as the programmer. And so that's pretty sweet. This really is the highlight of the presentation is Swagger, so you can stop listening now if you want, but it's really cool and we're going to keep going. I think the second biggest highlight is going to be Ness, which I'm going to show at the end, at the very last step. So this is Swagger. Again, this is part of the Open API initiative, and they're hoping that everyone starts having Swagger in their APIs so that we can just get in the common ground. I think it's actually a pretty good idea. Okay, so let's move on to the next thing. Actually, the next two things are pretty boring, and I'm not even going to show you. But I'll show you the diff here in source tree. So the two other npm modules are good. Good is for console logging. Actually, I guess I will show you. Can I do this? Ah, sweet. So what this will do is every time someone uses one of these endpoints, so let me grab this endpoint and go to it here in my browser. All good is going to do is it's going to display every single request. So this is just important for logging, right? Here's the different tags that are on that route. Here is the host. It was a GET request. Here was the path for that request, and here were the query objects that were passed with that request. And what was sent back was a 200 response, so that's good. And here's how long the request took to complete, which actually is kind of long. That's because the characters has to go through and it has to ping Swappy quite a bit. It makes a dozen or so requests, and so it's a little bit expensive. Hopefully yours isn't that long. But anyway, so if I were to refresh this a million times, you would just see here it's logging. And so this is good, just part of the Hapi ecosystem, and it can actually also be used outside of Hapi, but as you can see here, its GitHub is inside the project called Hapi.js. So Blipp is also fairly boring. The only thing it provides is when you start your server, it'll list out all the routes. So my server restarted because the JavaScript files changed. And so it's just going to show you all the routes that you have right now initialized. This column is for authentication on that specific route, which we're going to cover here in a second. As you can see here, here's our documentation route, but here's the two ones that we defined, and then here are the other three routes that just come because of Swagger. So that's a thing. So Blipp, good. They're good. Nothing too exciting. So now let's talk about Firebase. Firebase is exciting and it's something to be excited about. So here's where we're going to have problems. Try to write perfect code, and in this case, did not win. So put these back in here. So let's talk about Firebase first. So what is Firebase? Well, Firebase is a NoSQL database. It's an online thing. You can't like download your own instance of Firebase. You just use the Firebase API. Again, it's NoSQL, so it saves JSON in a big JSON object tree. I think it's pretty cool. It definitely has a lot of limitations, which really frustrate me, but also has a lot of benefits. One of them being that it has a free tier, which I've never ran out of, and so it's free for development. And actually, the free tier is pretty nice. So I have a love-hate relationship with Firebase. It just depends on the day. But Firebase was acquired by Google last year, and since then I can already tell a lot of improvements, and I think it's going to be a good technology. My biggest issue with Firebase is that to query things inside of the database, I don't think it's very good. It's very complicated to do and / impossible to do in a lot of your business cases. I think of Firebase more like an API than it is a database. So, but here's where our database looks like. So I initialized a database with instructions in the README of this Git repo that you can go and look at, my Git repo, GitHub repo. So I initialized it with some basic users. What each of these users look like is here's the username. The password is always the same as the username, but this is just the hashed version of the password. since you shouldn't ever save passwords inside your database. You should only save the hash versions. And then also the scope is only important because this is basically defining what this type of user is, and I use it inside of the Hapi authentication piece. So here's another user for. This is the user for hash, and its scope is a user. All the rest of these are going to be user 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So we have 1 admin, 9 users. And here's some votes data that I've been using because I've been demoing this a few times, and so every time that we add a new vote, it'll actually update this. So the reason why I'm using Firebase, first of all, what's the business case behind this? Right now our API is just returning character data, but part of our client that we wanted to build was the ability to upvote or downvote Star Wars characters, and so we need some way to be able to save that data, to persist it in a database, so that's why I'm using Firebase. So now we can create several new endpoints. Again, I'm not exactly sure some of the best practices on Firebase. I get a little confused, so if you're looking at the source code and you disagree with how I did it, I won't defend how I did it. I think there probably could have been better ways. I'm just not exactly sure how. I would like to get a little bit better at Firebase and that way of thinking. But here's our 4 new handlers, so we're just going to breeze through them. Here's a get handler for a vote / dynamic ID. Okay, it's using these handlers. Here's the description. This looks familiar, right? Here's our validation for our input, and then our response. So we have here, something new. The method is delete. We've only been using get up to this point, but now we're going to have a delete because this will delete votes. And so the HTTP, the word just escaped me, the request formats, protocols, I can't remember the word, but get, post, delete, put, all those things are semantic for what you're trying to accomplish. You can use any of them at any time. I could put delete on here if I wanted to, but that destroys the semantic meaning of it, right? So validation on output, the schema. So here's another one with a post. Okay, so I'm posting a vote. Again, that's semantic. And here's something cool we haven't seen before. We're validating the payload, so the JSON body that is coming to us. And so the JSON body better have a type on the object, and it better be a string, and it can only be up or down, and it is required, and here's the response. So here's our 4 new endpoints. The handler, like I said, this is where it gets a little confusing because I'm having to interact with the Firebase database, and I'm not exactly sure how to do all that. Basically, we come in, we request the Firebase information, and then we use our replies here. So nothing too exciting here. But one thing that we did learn about was about validating post payloads, as well as different request types, and I still can't think of the word, and a little bit about Firebase. To install Firebase on a project is fairly simple. Again, I'm not exactly sure all the best practices are, so I'm not going to speak to that very much, but basically you can instantiate an app here with credentials, and I've downloaded my own credentials here, which I'm not going to show you because they are my credentials, but I've shown you how to create your own credentials for Firebase on the GitHub repo inside of the README. So you're just going to have to look at that, and also decide whether I used it Firebase correctly here. If I didn't, I would appreciate some feedback on that, and I'll work on that. So that's Firebase. Let's move on. Authentication. What a concept. So authentication is basically saying some endpoints we want to validate. Sorry about that. I figured out what the problem was. In case you missed it, the error was that I was missing a closing curly brace. So, I'm totally derailed here. What am I doing? Oh, authentication. So Hapi has easy ways of being able to implement authentication. So what I do here, let me show you. So inside of server.js, I throw in this line here. What this is saying is that I'm going to implement an authentication strategy. I'm going to use Hapi-api-basic. And this true part says that I want to go ahead and apply authentication on every single route by default, unless I specify on that specific route not to include authentication. So if I were to put false here, it would do the opposite. None of the routes would have authentication on it unless I specified in the route to use authentication, but I want to go ahead and use authentication almost always. And here's the function that is going to handle whether or not the response is should come through or not. So it's gonna. This is really our authentication right here. So I'm importing it from here. I have this modules auth. It does a few things. Here is a way to be able. This is going to go check in Firebase to see if the user and password that were passed in were valid, if they exist inside of our Firebase. And if they do, go ahead and expose this data about the user to be used for every route. Every route can now see this data. If not, then go ahead and deny them access. And so you can take a look at this file and see exactly what was going on. This is, again, using HTTP basic authentication, and so in order to get that working, I'm going to use Postman because Postman is pretty cool. So from now on, every single route is going to require authentication. So using Postman, I can simulate that here. There's basic auth, and you have to pass in a username and password on top of every single request. Okay, and then when I send it, please work, please work. Live coding is nerve-wracking. Sweet, it worked. So it responded back with our data just the same, right? Just the same. But if I put in a bad username or password and I tried to fetch it, look, unauthorized, bad username or password. So the client themselves don't get to see what's going on. We can do some logging, which I believe I have a little bit. Actually, all I say is user blah, 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 blah was rejected access. So since this is not a valid user, they cannot get to that route. So this is basic authentication, and there's a lot that goes into it, and I'm not an expert on authentication, but I do know that Hapi provides it well and does a good job with it. And like I said, this true here puts it on every single route by default unless I specify otherwise. Now I have specified a few places here. For instance, the API/v1/user, I have chosen, I don't know if it's a good decision or not, to not validate that, because this is what, in our client, I have a login portal where they log in, and so we need to validate if their login credentials match a user. And so that's why, since they're not logged in yet, we can't pass in credentials, and so I've chosen to leave this open so that we can validate users. Again, I could start, I'm sure, a fire of a conversation debating whether or not that should be false or not. But all the rest of these, I believe, are using just basic authentication. The only exception here is this very last one, where we can create a new user using a post. So we can create users here. What I've done here is I've scoped it down to where this endpoint can only be accessed by admins. So that was part of the whole scope that I was showing earlier. So not only can you decide whether to open up a route to the world or not, you can also decide what type of user can access that endpoint. And what it's deciding is this can be an array of different strings, basically. But the scope, how that's decided is in our auth, what we were exposing. If you want to use scope, you have to expose a scope object here. And in this case, I'm just putting whatever was in the Firebase. So anyway, that is authentication, and it's pretty sweet. The other thing that we can do now is that when they were voting beforehand in the GitHub, I was having to kind of mock what the user ID was that was voting. But now we can get that exposed data that we were just looking at, and the exposed data is always available underneath request.auth.credentials. And so in that case, one of the things that we were exposing was the ID. In fact, we only exposed two things, the ID and scope. So we're just using the ID here. So that way when we're saving information in Firebase, we can actually know who was the person that saved it. And I think that APIs should have, well, depending on your needs, but a lot of APIs should have authentication somehow. And I know that basic authentication is not as cool, has OAuth and several different things, but like I said, I'm not an expert on that stuff, and so I'm going to stay out of that conversation as much as I can. So that's authentication. Pretty cool. The next one's really boring. It's cores. Of course, so your browser, part of browser security is that it gets worried whenever a client like HTML JavaScript tries to ping for information from an API on a different domain. And when it tries to return it, it gets nervous about that trust issue. And so by default, that's not allowed. Now, what you can do is the request can include some headers that say that it allows certain domains to consume this request. And so that's basically what CORS is. CORS is the protocol behind all of that, but the Hapi-cors module is makes this easy. So what I'm allowing is I'm allowing every single origin or every single host to be able to use this API. I'm saying here's the different headers that they can view. Here's the different methods that are allowed and different things like that. So is CORS awesome? It probably is. I'm not a security expert, and so as a programmer, I just have to learn to work with it, and whether I like it or not. And so now let's take a look at our plugins, because they're starting to get a little bit bigger now as we've been adding all these different things. I'm just adding one at a time. Blipp was small enough that I just put it inline here, but our basic auth was pretty easy. But anyway, I never switched to actually double clicking on it for CORS. I'm not going to do it quite yet, if that's okay. Hapi-api-versions. I don't know. Let's go ahead and look at it. There is an npm package called Hapi-api-versions. I've installed it here, Hapi-api-version. And what I've declared here is that there's really only two versions. There's 1 and 2. The default version is 1. So what does this plugin allow us to do? Well, a few things. So first off, let's go to routes though and explore. So I've added some more routes. I'm sure I have, otherwise, okay. So we have a planets route, right? Here's the V1, so here's the version 1 for planets. So it has all this stuff, but then, as always happens, we come down the road and either people want different types of information, or they have different types of input to give, whatever, however that happens. So I'm going to create another endpoint for the version 2 of this. The reason behind that is that people are using your API, right? And so if you change the inputs that are accepted, or if you change what is being responded to, all of a sudden their app breaks because they were expecting it in one way and you're starting to provide it in another way. So very bad idea, very, very bad idea to ever change your endpoint without at least notifying your user. And so what you do then is you just start creating versioned endpoints, right? Planets, version 2. So what I've done here, I've put a tag on this, and the tag's actually not important, but so if I want this specific version, I can go to that. If I want this specific version, I can go to that. But what the Hapi-api version does, it actually allows me in my browser to just go to API/planets, and it will grab the default version that I've specified, which is 1 in this case, and it'll go ahead and throw in V1 into there. And it also allows for some other things like a specific vendor, if they have their own version, then they can throw in a header, and it can check for that header and make some logical choices based on that. it basically, a lot of people don't think about versions right off the front. They should. It's not too hard to add in afterward, and you can see, I mean, I have quite a bit here, but that's because I'm adding in new routes just to demonstrate versions. But if I wanted to throw this in later, I could definitely do that, and there's not too big of a problem. So, and this gets into some of the grouping here. Let's go ahead and see. Let's hope that this is still working. It looks like it is. And let's see, our Swagger page has us getting bigger and bigger. So sweet. So here's the different Star Wars endpoints. And here's the 3 vote endpoints. We have a delete, a get, and a post. And here's our 2 user endpoints. If we look at these, you know, we're really finding a lot about this. This doesn't return anything. Well, that was kind of instructive, right? Here's a post. We can actually, part of Hapi Swagger is that we can go ahead and throw in the body here, which all the JSON body in this case is, it just contains one object or one node type, and it's an enum, so there's only 2 valid types. But you can actually simulate posting information, which is really cool. If you can't tell, I'm the biggest fan of Hapi Swagger, and I think everyone should use it. And here, if I wanted to limit to only see the version 2 route, I just throw on this tags equals version 2. That's why I added that tag. Or version 1 routes here. Or if I wanted to see all of them, I just remove that filtering. So, pretty cool. We're getting some intense stuff here going on. So, we've come to the very last step, which is Ness. Of course, it's called Ness. It's a pun. It's built for Hapi, so Hapi Ness. What it allows you to do is create sockets for people to subscribe to. And so let me see if I can explain this real quick. So when you make a request to an API, it responds back. And usually after that, the agreement, the connection is just absolved. It doesn't exist anymore. It opens, fetches the information, receives it, and then closes the connection. What a socket is, basically, my version of explaining this is, we create a tunnel between us and the publisher of the socket. And anytime, previously, the only time these two could communicate is when the client initiated a request. So you could only pull data. There's only one direction. I could post data, but anytime I wanted new data, I had to pull it myself. Well, what sockets allow to happen is for the server to push data to the client without the client ever having requested it. So you can use this in a lot of circumstances. For instance, the Facebook Messenger app, right? You don't, in order to get a new message, you don't refresh the browser to make a new request, right? That would be silly. Your second option, if you were not very smart about it, is you could have an AJAX request that goes and checks every second for a repeating AJAX request that just goes and checks for new information all the time. That would be a lame way of doing it, but it would accomplish the same thing that Facebook's currently doing. What sockets, though, do is make this very easy. It creates a tunnel between the endpoint, the client, and I guess we'll use the word server here. And anytime the server receives, or anytime the server wants to, it can push new data. So it gets a new message, boom, push the data. It gets another new message, boom, push the data. So Ness allows us to create that socket, making our API very, very powerful. So to implement it, there's a few things that are going on. Oh, I had already switched to that, but that's okay. So how I've chosen to do this is this way. Any endpoint that I wanted to be able to be subscribed to create a socket for, I've thrown on this tag of socket. Okay, this is my own convention. This is my own way of doing it. Then what I did was I made this module, which what it does is it goes through and looks at all the routes that we have available, and it looks for any route that contains the word socket, or any route that has a tag of socket. Speaking of which, there's another technology that I never mentioned earlier, probably because I don't know how to pronounce it. Probably Hoke. Anyway, it's just part of Hapi. It's a collection of Hapi functions. It's like kind of a grab-all bag. It has a lot of random stuff in there. One of them is that it can check a collection and see if this is inside of it, so the contain. So anything that has socket here, and all I'm doing here is I am saying go ahead and add a subscription. And now this subscription functionality came because in our plugins we've registered Ness, and so now we can use server.subscription to register a subscription. So that's the first step, and all this functionality is just to make that very easy, is seamless. I just add socket, has a tag, and boom, it just works. The second thing that needs to happen, so the way I've chosen to do it is anytime someone votes, it then the server then pushes out an update to all the clients saying a new vote has happened. So what I have here is anytime someone posts a new vote, it has all this logic to add it to the database. After it has saved it into the database, I then publish to clients that are listening on that route. I publish this new data. So all of the clients that are subscribed to this route will now get this data. So that's kind of cool. It's actually really cool. The only other thing is I never displayed the client because this isn't what I was trying to teach, and I wrote this client in a React starter kit I hadn't used before just to learn how to use it. So basically most of the time in the client I'm using this API. I'm just using a fetch method. You know, I'm trying to get data and I'm passing it my credentials here. This is that part of that Hapi-basic authentication there, and then I parse the JSON response. Now I've changed it just for this instance only, where Ness provides a client, client-based JavaScript. So Ness has something for server and something for client. So here I'm creating a new client, something that will listen to subscriptions, and so I go ahead and request the data the first time, and this just acts like a normal request. It gets the information back, but then I subscribe for any changes. So any time that the server wants to, it can push data to me, and then I handle that data. So what that allows us to do is this. Let's see if this is still working. By the way, this whole login thing is going against our authentication scheme, which is pretty cool. But if I were to, let me open up a anonymous tab here, and let me use user1. Oh, not good. Okay, apparently user1's not a thing. So both of these are subscribing to a socket, right? So if what I do on one of these screens is going to affect the other. So if I add one here, you saw that it changed here. So if I upvote here, or if I downvote here, look on the left hand side of the screen, boom, it reflected here. So whatever I'm doing over here is having effects over here, because they're both subscribed to subscriptions over there. So same thing, if I went over here and downvoted this, it affected over here. So if I had 17 tabs open, they would all be very live and very updated and refreshed, and which in this day and age is actually important, because nobody really expects to have to refresh their browser anymore. They just expect it to always be updated. And that's possible through Hapi-Ness plugin. So let's go over some of the things we've learned. So Hapi is a great option for building APIs. It's a good option because it can validate input, it can validate output. It was really built for APIs and for services, and is a great option. We learned about Swagger, which is an awesome specification, and when we use it, we get this really, really awesome Swagger UI, which makes programming just great. Again, why would you ever build an API that people don't know how to use? You shouldn't have built it in the first place. It did you no good. And then we've added several different packages, everything from logging to Ness, and allowing us to have live data. And so what I'm going to end on is just my thoughts about APIs. I told you at the very beginning I'm a very big fan, and here's why. So a long time ago when grandma was programming the internet, what she would do is if she wanted to vote for a Star Wars character, she would open up her HTML page and she would write in the functionality to vote for a character right inside where she needed it, immediately close to the code, because that's just how she did it. But then all of a sudden, what comes along is somebody wants the same ability to vote but on a different page. So what she does is grandma copies and pastes the code in 2 different places, and she has a maintenance nightmare, right? So then several years later, when now another generation down, my parents were programming the internet, they would take these common functionalities and build libraries out of them and modules and import them in. That works out great. It's a really good idea. But what happens now all of a sudden, that module is written in JavaScript, and then their boss comes to them and they say, because now we live in the modern day age, right, where we have the Internet of Things, where we want our iPhone app to be able to have that same functionality that we wrote specifically in JavaScript for just the web. But now we want our iPhone app to be able to do it, and we want our Android to be able to vote, and now we want our toaster to vote, our fridge to vote, our Fitbit to vote. Everything wants to vote. The whole Internet of Things. Our shoes want to vote. Like everything is connected to the internet, and they all want to do that same functionality. And that functionality usually has to do with data. And so now all of a sudden you're like, well, okay, iPhone, I can't use JavaScript, so I can't import that module in. And so how do you do it? And the solution is APIs, because every single programming language has the ability to be able to ping to send an HTTP request. And if we build out APIs, all of a sudden we create this layer where we can write the functionality once and everyone can use it. Our toasters can use it. Everyone that wants to consume it can use it. And they don't even have to be on premise to be able to use it. Of course, you can lock it down and set up your own restrictions to where only internally your own internal services can use it, which is a good idea a lot of the times. Maybe you don't want to expose your API like YouTube has, but maybe you do want to expose your API like YouTube has, and that's really the only way to do it, is to build a RESTful API, or I guess SOAP API. In this instance, it doesn't matter. An HTTP looking API for people to be able to use. And my other point is, you're going to have to build the functionality anyway. So if you wanted to embed it into your program, you're going to have to write it. So why not write it in a way to where it's scalable and everyone can use it? And I think APIs is really the solution to that. And so that's my presentation. I think that this is a production-ready API. I think that you can write production-ready APIs in node.js. Obviously, Walmart thought so too. That's why they came up with Hapi. And so hopefully that was a benefit. And if you have any response to this presentation, please leave comments below, and I'd be happy to respond back and forth with you. Thank you.